Hello there. This week on Talking Europe, how secure is your job amid the coronavirus pandemic? Today, I'm going to be speaking to the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. This, as the number of people out of work in the euro area increases for another month. Tens of millions of people, of course, remain on furlough and short-time work schemes, and deeper economic crisis is looming. Nicolas, Schmit, thank you very much for being our guest this week.
Yes, thank you.
I'd like to start, of course, with the latest unemployment figures for the eurozone that came out just a couple of days ago. No surprise that it's gone up to 7.3% for the eurozone in April. Most economists are predicting a severe economic downturn in the coming months. How much worse do you expect unemployment to get?
Well, I think we are already in a very severe downturn now. But this does not yet reflect so much in the unemployment figures. But I fear that we will go up to 10%. That's also that corresponds also to forecasts which we have.
Well, some say that the lockdowns that Europe has seen over the past few weeks were perhaps too severe and caused too much economic damage. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the lockdown was absolutely justified because if there had been no lockdown, we would have faced a much worse situation in terms of health, in terms of numbers of people infected, in terms also of people dying from this disease. And we can see it where the lockdown has been not so severe. The numbers of people who have died from the virus have been quite important. So I think it was a harsh measure, but it was unfortunately an indispensable one.
Now, at the moment, we've just had in France, for example, one of the top scientists here saying that the pandemic is under control in France, at least. Things do seem to obviously have calmed down. Economies are reopening, but there's much worry about a second spike of the infection rate in the coming months. Do you believe that European economies could cope with similarly severe and drastic measures as we saw in the spring if there is indeed a second infection spike?
Well, I do not like to assume that we will have this second wave or second pandemic. And therefore, we have to put into place all the precautions, all the measures which will prevent us from having such a second wave. I think this is very important. I do not want to now to assume what happens if. I think what is important is now to take the right measures and to start the economy. This is happening now. And I think we have good arguments, and the situation is improving in most of our member states. So I think we have now to build on that and not try to add uncertainty to uncertainty. What we have to build up now is confidence.
Just talking about one scheme that the European Commission did launch over the past few weeks, the SURE scheme, support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency is what that stands for, as you well know. It's worth 100 billion euros in loans to member states to support short-time work schemes and the self-employed. How much longer could this fund keep going?
Well, first, I think what saved us from massive unemployment we see, for instance, in the US, was this short-time work scheme, which most of the member states introduced or just implemented. We have, with this scheme, we support those countries who have a lot of people in short time. Millions of Europeans are or have been in short time. And we have an instrument going up to 100 billion, 100 billion euros. And that's the limit. Now, we will start implementing this scheme by end of July or at the latest in September. And well, then we see how fast this money will be used. It's a limit, 100 billion. This covers a lot of expenses which have been made we have to see. But I think it's a very important instrument to support those countries which had to rely on this scheme.
Now, the Sure Fund was based on an idea for a European unemployment reinsurance scheme, which was supposed to be finalised later on this year. That plan was come up with before the pandemic. Would you intend for this to become a permanent policy instrument?
Well, I think this is a permanent instrument. We are working on that. This will take some time, but this is on our agenda. This remains on our agenda. What we needed now was a scheme responding to the present situation, and that was done very rapidly, by the way, by putting into place this SURE instrument. Now we start together with my colleague Commissioner Gentiloni to work on the permanent instrument, but this will not be in place in the next months. But we are starting our work.
I'd just like to talk about the workers from one very well-known European company, which has been in the news this week. There's been outrage here in France from the government over the budget airline Ryanair. It's wanting workers to accept either a pay cut between 10 and 20% or redundancy. Do you see this as an acceptable offer or indeed ultimatum?
Well, you know, this is a very difficult situation, and for the Commission to answer, I think this is an issue which has to be dealt with between social partners at the level of the company. So I certainly understand people who do not like to have cuts in their wages. I understand that it is a sector which has been hit quite severely by this crisis. So this is, I would invite social partners to sit together and to try to find the right and balanced solution, and not to impose from the outset one way to go.
Now, we're just looking more broadly at wage inequality, not necessarily within the time of the pandemic. We're told that reducing wage inequality is a priority for your Commission. Consultations on minimum wages are underway. Just to be clear on this, are you intending to bring in a European minimum wage?
No, it would be totally impossible, unrealistic, to have one single minimum wage for whole Europe. What we want to have, and what we need really, is a framework in which minimum wages can evolve. And we have big gaps between minimum wages in Europe. It's 1 to 6, 1 to 7. And this does not reflect neither the living standard, neither the productivity in the different countries. So we will push those countries which are at a very low level of minimum wage, where finally people earning a minimum wage are in a situation of poverty, to review and to readapt the level of the minimum wage. That's the purpose of this framework. We cannot, also legally speaking, impose any precise amount or for whole Europe. This is, as I said, unrealistic, or even for one single country.
Looking at European decision-making, there's some big decisions to be made later on this month about the recovery plan for the EU. The Commission is proposing a recovery fund from the pandemic worth 750 billion euros, but there are big disagreements over how the money would be handed out, for example. Do you expect that the current plan from your Commission will get the green light from member states at the summit later this June?
Well, I hope so, because this is a question of common interest. And all countries, all member states are really directly impacted, because what is at stake? Do we manage to kickstart the European economy? Do we really reduce the divergences which this crisis has increased? And this is not a question of southern countries or northern countries. Though everybody has been impacted, but some have been impacted more than others.
But some countries believe that they're being asked to pay for the recovery of other states.
No, it's not a question to pay for somebody else. It's to pay to safeguard, first, the internal market, to pay for the stability, economic stability, but at a second stage, maybe also political stability in Europe, to pay for the stability of the eurozone. That's what is at stake. And if we threaten the internal market, well, everybody will be a loser, and especially those who are the big exporters in Europe. And the big exporters might be also those who might pay a bit more, but at the end, they are also the beneficiaries of the internal market and the beneficiary of stability, economic stability in Europe.
All right, I'd just like to finish on one question. We don't have much time left, but of course, with the protests all around the world against racial discrimination, support for the Black Lives Matter movement, there's also been support from the European Union for peaceful protest. The last European Commission failed to complete work on an anti-discrimination directive for the EU. Will the Commission that you're part of be able to complete this directive?
Hopefully. I think that anti-discrimination, fighting racism, fighting anti-Semitism is more important than ever. And I think Europe, our values are exactly based on this. And I think what people expect is that we stand up for these values everywhere.
All right, Nicolas Schmit, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for speaking to us here on Talking Europe. And thanks to you as well for watching. Do stay with us for part 2 of the programme in a couple of minutes' time.